Was the American dream always just a nightmare in disguise? For decades, it meant a steady job, a two-bedroom house with a white picket fence, and the classic 2.5 kids. Maybe even a college fund tucked away. But does that dream still exist? Today, wages are flat and debt is crushing. The very bedrock of the economy is cracking beneath our feet. So what happens next? On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're exposing the death of American capitalism. Capitalism is one of those popular buzzwords that you have probably heard 1,000 times. It's a concept that's both simple and complicated. Depending on who you ask, the earliest versions of capitalism appeared centuries before America even existed. The core of capitalism is an idea that it's a means of production. It's a pretty big umbrella term for things like the infrastructure, equipment, resources, and labor involved in making products or services. And it can be privately owned by someone who isn't actively taking part in all of that stuff, and the resources made from selling those goods and services can be invested back into the process to make it bigger and, in theory, better. The name for those resources is capital, hence capitalism. Let's just say you're a cobbler, someone who makes shoes for a living. If you want to sell some nice leather boots, you'd either buy the leather or tan it yourself. Then you design the shoe, cut the leather into the right shapes in your workshop, fuse it all together, and now you got yourself a pair of boots to sell. You can set the price of those boots based on the cost of the materials and the time it took you to make them, and a little extra for the skill you've built over the years. If you're lucky, you might just make enough off of those shoes to support yourself and maybe your family. But capitalists think a lot bigger than that. One highly skilled artisan might be able to craft a beautiful boot, but that takes time. What if you want to scale the process? Maybe the capitalist has family money, profits from another industry, or loans from the wealthy. With that cash, he snaps up a factory and begins hiring workers. Rather than one skilled person who makes a whole shoe, you hire one person to design the shoe, another person to cut the leather, another to sew it all together. None of them need the skills going in, but each job is simple enough that it's easy to train. With a production line of specialized workers, they can make and sell those boots a lot faster, which means the general public gets a lot more choice. In theory, it can be a more stable living for the workers too. They don't need to worry about marketing the products to their customers or getting the raw materials from their suppliers. The only thing they need to do is their little bit again and again. But each person involved in the process makes less than the cobbler. It's not just the extra overhead of a bigger system. The capitalist who set it up also wants his cut for putting in the money. And if they're particularly greedy, they can do one or more of three things: pay workers terrible wages, cut corners on production, or hit the consumer with a price tag way higher than the boots deserve. But in theory, capitalism has a mechanism built in for stopping this from happening: competition. In an ideal capitalist world, there isn't just one sole person running an industrialized cobbling business. There might be a huge number of businesses doing this, and they are competing both for market share and the best talent for their labor. If the shoes are overpriced or the quality is poor, the customer can go elsewhere that sells better quality shoes for less. And if the work conditions are poor and the pay is terrible, employees can leave and join rival competitors. And that's when production lines fall apart. This is the free market, one of the core concepts of capitalism in action. The daddy of capitalism, Scottish economist Adam Smith, described capitalism as a system that turned selfishness into something useful. Since employers want to keep both customers and workers, it's in their interest to keep prices and wages fair and competitive. And nowhere on earth has capitalism flourished more than in the United States. In 1905, economist Max Weber published The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He argued that America's Protestant roots were a big reason the system took hold so strongly. A nation that hated monarchy from the very beginning became the perfect breeding ground for capitalism. And as the centuries went on and European countries kept kneecapping each other in petty wars, the U.S. saw its industrial sector grow and grow. By the end of World War I, it was a true capitalist powerhouse on the world stage. This saw the birth of the iconic American industrial heavy hitters like AT&T, Levi's, Coca-Cola, and, of course, Ford. The first company to make affordable mass-produced cars. Ford's unprecedented growth came from the same production line method we described earlier with our hypothetical shoe business. But it's not just the manufacturers that flourished in the U.S. after the Great Depression. More on that later. It was the other key part of capitalism too, the consumers. After World War II, women had entered the workforce, creating a larger labor pool and more people with disposable income. The booming post-war economy gave rise to a strong middle class, and with it, plenty of cash to spend. Meanwhile, much of the world was still recovering from mass bombings, invasions, occupations, and genocides. Selling goods to the American people became the most lucrative deal in the world, so plenty of American manufacturers could get rich selling their products domestically and avoiding tariffs. For a brief moment, it seemed like the whole capitalism thing might be the US's golden ticket to global supremacy and the greatest quality of life for its people. And then it all started tumbling down. The slow, agonizing death of American capitalism began with increased globalization of trade not long after World War II. The thing about markets under capitalism is, for them to stay healthy, they always need to grow their profits. This can happen in three ways, like we were mentioning earlier: less expensive manufacturing, higher market share, or more expensive products. But any one of those methods can be risky in a free market of choice for both consumers and workers. So what if you just pushed manufacturing somewhere else? Thanks to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and much later the World Trade Organization, the waters were smooth for international trade. American companies started realizing that they could save a lot of money by putting their manufacturing plants in developing countries with weaker economies. They would ship the goods back to the US to sell them to American consumers at considerable markup, meaning a nice fat profit. And because some of these companies rely on sweatshop labor, their workers don't have the freedom to walk away when pay or conditions are terrible. Massive trade deficits with countries where US companies moved their factories have dragged down wage growth for Americans without a college degree. From 1979 to the mid-2010s, this group saw their wages shrink by about 5 or 6%. That's bad enough, but it's even worse when you compare it to the almost 226% rise in prices during the same period. But you wouldn't see that on the news, where many of the companies outsourcing jobs overseas are buying lucrative ad spots. And if it seems like this has gotten even worse in the last few years, you are not just imagining things. The globalization of trade over domestic manufacturing made it extremely vulnerable to globe-shaking events like the COVID-19 pandemic. This caused a lot of these trade flows to collapse for months on end, an event we are still seeing the ramifications of today in unchecked inflation. However, as much as every politician hopes to ride into office on promises of bringing back manufacturing jobs like a magic carpet, there is no putting that genie back in the bottle without entirely restructuring the US economy. Unless the 1% is willing to take massive cuts to their wealth or pass the expense on to consumers and risk losing them, manufacturing will likely stay abroad. Neither option looks appealing. And without government pressure, which isn't coming, nothing is going to change. The US is now a post-industrial capitalist society. And what does that mean for you? Well, just take a look at your wage packet. We've seen pay for all but the richest take a sharp drop in the middle of a cost of living crisis. A study conducted on job website ZipRecruiter in 2023 found 48% of the 2,000 companies surveyed had dropped pay rates for some of their roles, especially the ones that were already the lowest paying. As prices rise, companies scale back to save money, creating an oversupply of labor that allows employers to lowball potential recruits. The competition for job offers is so low that there is no incentive to offer anything better. And we are all feeling this in our wallets on a day-to-day basis. A CBS poll found that 2 out of 3 Americans are stressed about their finances, and we are insanely jealous of that third American. And this still isn't as bad as the 3 out of 4 Americans who claim that their income hasn't managed to keep up with rampant inflation. Many Americans are having to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, with zero hope of ever rising out of their economic bracket. For the average American, there's also the anchor of consumer debt hanging around their neck. That's an average of almost $90,000. From a soul-crushing combination of credit card debt, auto loans, mortgage and personal loans, home equity lines of credit, and student loans. In theory, education should be the great equalizer, giving Americans equal opportunities to control their life and improve their chances in the job market. But how could that be possible when teaching itself is becoming a more hostile profession to get involved with? When adjusting for inflation, teachers in many states are making 5% less than they did 10 years ago, despite attempts at pay increases. For people in the rapidly dissolving middle class, some of the traditional markets of capitalist success now feel hopelessly out of reach. And what's a better example of this than homeownership? In 2024, only 24% of housing sales were by first-time homebuyers. It's down an eye-watering 50% from 2010. These days, the average age of a first-time homebuyer is 38, 10 years above the historical norm for home buying. Back in March 2025, only 1 in 5 homes was seen as affordable for someone with a $75,000 annual salary. If you are making a little less than that at $50,000, you can only afford 8.7% of home listings. That's down 9.4% from 2024. And while being forced into the position of the eternal renter is pretty bad, an even worse possibility is becoming increasingly likely. Since 2024, homelessness in the United States has risen a completely depressing 18%. That's around 771,000 people, almost a million Americans sleeping in their cars or on the streets. 150,000 of them are children. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, who conducted the reports on these matters, have said these are the worst numbers they have ever seen. If these trends hold up, that means one of the most basic tenets of the American dream, the house with the white picket fence, is going to be completely unattainable for the majority of Americans. The only way they'll ever be able to experience it is actually in their dreams. But what about the 2.5 kids? Well, it turns out in this modern form of American capitalism, your prospects for that ain't looking so good either. There are around 10 million kids in the childcare system around the U.S., with an average cost of nearly $1,000 a month per child. And that is on the cheaper end. In California, you're looking closer to $2,000 per month. And that's not even factoring in costs of food, clothes, and leisure, which are only going to increase as they grow. And what about the promise that you'll be able to retire in your twilight years to rest, relax, and pursue your passions while living off your savings and pension? We're sorry to tell you that that window is closing too. 11 million Americans, 1 in 5 people over 65, are still working, with no escape but the grave in sight. 50% of women and 47% of men between the ages of 55 and 66 have no retirement savings. Meanwhile, 90 private jets flew to the second wedding of Jeff Bezos. The divide between the haves and the have-nots seems to be getting wider and wider. According to 2025 census data, we have seen the income of the average household stagnate since the pandemic, while the richest households in the country have actually seen a little boost. Normal people were suffering during the worst years of the pandemic lockdown, and the billionaire class was actually getting richer. The combined wealth of all U.S. billionaires increased by just over $2 trillion between March 18, 2020 and October 15, 2021, going from approximately $2.9 trillion to around $5 trillion. The U.S. has over 700 billionaires, the most of any country in the world. But let's look at the 5 richest people in that period. Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, Elon Musk, and of course the happily married Jeff Bezos. In that lockdown period, their combined wealth grew 123%. In the first financial quarter of 2025, the bottom 50% of earners in the U.S. owned only a combined 2.5% of all the wealth in the U.S. The richest 1% now own half of all U.S. stocks and mutual funds, up from 40% in 2002, according to the Federal Reserve. So when the news celebrates a booming stock market, we know who is really cashing in, and it's not us. It's important to remember that we have been here before. The Roaring '20s weren't exactly roaring for everyone. While the Gatsbys of the world were living it up, average people were having a harder time keeping it together. In 1923, the Supreme Court ruled that the minimum wage laws were unconstitutional, so if employers wanted to pay chicken feed to their workers, they could. In 1926, President Coolidge cut taxes for the rich to stimulate the economy, and this ended up having the absolute opposite effect. By 1929, deregulation had concentrated wealth to a staggering degree. Just 0.1% of the population held 34% of the nation's wealth, the same as the bottom 42% combined. Half of all corporate wealth in a country of more than 100 million people was controlled by only 200 companies. Despite corporate profits rising by around 62% over the course of the decade, that success did not trickle down. In October of 1929, the U.S. economy exploded, and even that is putting it mildly. One of the main reasons why the stock market crashed and the U.S. banking system went belly up is a pretty obvious result of short-sightedness and greed. Companies paid their workers terrible money to create a huge amount of industrial output and products, but because everyone was making terrible money, they had no purchasing power. So there was nobody to buy the products that those companies overproduced. Everyone was sitting on a surplus of overpriced goods, from agriculture to consumer products, and that set the stage for the Great Depression. What saved America back then was the New Deal, put in place by Franklin D. Roosevelt, under the economic philosophies of Maynard Keynes. Keynes, to put it simply, believed in the importance of circulation. A good, healthy economy is one where the money is always flowing. Bosses pay their workers well, who then can buy products with their disposable income, sending money back to the bosses. They use it to make more products and pay their workers. Meanwhile, the government makes a pretty penny on taxes from all those money movements. If there are strong labor protections in place, this system can work out for everybody. But that means less of the collective wealth is consolidated in the hands of the ultra-wealthy, our American super-capitalists. Faced with labor laws that make them pay fair wages, companies found a workaround. Well, two of them: corporate lobbying and the gig economy. Uber, Airbnb, DoorDash, Fiverr, Upwork, CrowdSpring, Etsy, and LegalZoom all have one thing in common. They are not jobs, they are gigs. They sit in a legal gray area that lacks the protections or regulation of traditional employment, and they are becoming an increasingly popular way to monetize every aspect of life while saving money for the companies. Fewer people in a legal sense are employees than ever. From taxi drivers to writers of online edutainment videos, all of these people are contractors, and that is an entirely different dynamic to traditional employment on paper. An estimated 64 million Americans, representing 38% of the U.S. workforce, did freelance work in 2023. That is 4 million more than 2022, and it's only gotten worse since. And how do corporations keep all those loopholes that save money for them and destroy security for workers? Two magical little words: corporate lobbying. This is when corporations and other groups pay to influence the actions of the jokers in Congress. 2024 saw an all-time high of lobbying costs, specifically $4.4 billion. It's legally protected by the First Amendment and the Lobbying Disclosure Act. It makes sure that when money is protected speech, those with the most money will always have the loudest voices. They keep tax loopholes wide open. They make sure their failures get bailed out with taxpayer money. And when all else fails, a struggling company can legally buy back its own shares, artificially boosting value through false scarcity. But competition is supposed to keep them honest. So naturally, they're trying to destroy it. And the worst part? They're on their way. Companies empower themselves to act horribly when they move to aggressively crush their competition, whether it's through predatory pricing or the much more common monopoly-building methods of mergers and acquisitions. Larger companies buy up or merge with smaller ones, so they soon become the only choice on the market. And with enough lobbying money, you can keep the Federal Trade Commission off your back for a very long time. Don't believe us? Here are some companies you may know who have had antitrust complaints against them: Google, Amazon, Apple, Visa, and Live Nation Ticketmaster. It goes without saying that this is terrible for consumers and workers, but it's not getting better. Right now, the technologies that these companies are investing most heavily in, like artificial intelligence, are primed to make life worse of all for us. But what happens then? Will things hit a breaking point where we all collectively say, enough is enough, break down the system as it is, and work on building something better? Or are we just in the middle part of a domino chain leading to something a lot worse? For the middle and working class, things are looking pretty apocalyptic. Without reform or revolution, all the scary numbers that you've heard are only going to get worse. Wages, jobs, housing, debt, and homelessness. Monopolies are consolidating wealth and power like never before. They're engaging in crony capitalism that turns the government into their lapdog, and that leads to a world of techno-feudalism, where personal freedoms collapse right alongside personal wealth. One way or another, one thing is certain: with the direction that American capitalism is going, we're all gonna feel the hurt. You might be witnessing the death of capitalism right now, but it's not the first time the country has been pushed to the brink. Watch tariff that destroyed the American economy in just weeks to see how it all collapsed before. Or click on this video instead.